My name is Zena and I'm a senior researcher from the University of Exeter. I'll be presenting submission 8350 entitled Data Reuse Comparing the Principles. The work has been completed in collaboration with Glen Hart from the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, also known as DSTL. In today's presentation, I'll give a brief overview of the aims and objectives of this work before presenting the findings of a comparison of a selection of principles that have been suggested as necessary to facilitate an ecosystem where data is shared and reused. I'll present some initial thoughts on the role that policy plays before concluding the paper with an indication of how we are moving forward with this work. The way data is designed, captured and managed comprises approaches that are primarily intended for single-use purposes, resulting in huge amounts of data being generated. Government and commercial organisations have agreed vast amounts of data which is worth billions of pounds, but it is not being reused. Data reuse could deliver better value from the initial investments that are being made by both government or private sectors. The ability to reuse data could allow an organisation to use their resources more efficiently, potentially saving time and money. The work reported here has come out of a project entitled Investigating the Problem of Data Reuse. Funded by the Alan Turing Institute and DSTL, the project identified the current state of play with respect to the impediments to data reuse, considering both the technical and social aspects of the problem. The state of the art was identified through two systematic literature reviews, one focusing on the technical side and one focusing on the non-technical or social point of view. The reviews were analysed and a mapping produced between the two reports that identified any dependencies and links. This information was used to produce an innovative interdisciplinary research agenda that will be published as part of the final report next year. A little bit of background to the literature reviews. So we had to scope the project to ensure that we could complete it in time and within budget. So to be in scope, papers had to be open access, written in English, be published in the last 5 years, so since 2017, be available in Scopus or Web of Science, and come from an institution that was based in either the UK or the US. An initial set of literature was identified using the search phrases data reuse, reusing data and data sharing. These phrases had to appear in the title, abstract or keywords. Any papers that did not have an abstract or were considered out of scope were removed, leaving us with a final set of literature that we could consider. Further work will see some of these requirements expanded, particularly the timeframes that we're looking at, so considering research from more than 5 years ago, and also considering research that's coming out of institutions based outside the US or the UK. The literature reviews were designed to help us understand what the state of the art looked like. We were able to identify key themes, application areas, research projects and research groups, as well as any challenges that were considered still to be addressed. One of the themes that was identified was the use of principles or guidelines that were designed to improve and ensure best practice for data sharing and data reuse. This paper focuses on the papers that were identified in this theme. Specifically, this paper addresses the research question: how do the different sets of principles that have been suggested compare, and what role does policy play? Seven papers were identified as presenting these sets of principles or guidelines. Of the 7 papers that were identified, 4 papers focused on clinical or health-related data, seen here in blue, 1 focused on a particular sector, namely engineering, depicted here in red, and 2 papers focused on particular communities. So 1, the interactive information retrieval community, shown in black, and shown in green, this paper focused on statisticians. A brief overview of each of these papers can be found in our discussion paper on the conference platform. A comparison of the 7 papers has identified 9 themes that were replicated across the different papers. These can be seen here on this slide. The infrastructure must support the management, curation, discovery, analysis and visualization of the data. A focus on shared data infrastructure was considered to ensure and maintain quality, security, access to data and increase the adoption of standards. Data sharing is more than just putting information online. Resources are required to make it sustainable. Ideally, dedicated resources are required to facilitate data sharing and therefore data reuse. Resources could include research design, the infrastructure, and the data itself. Data sharing and data reuse will only be possible if it is planned for. Data management planning must occur at the early stages of the research before any data is collected and consider the whole data life cycle. Planning should begin with a documented data management plan. If society is to benefit from the maximum value of the data, all research resources should be documented in as much detail as possible. This includes the code, any models, guidance, insights, as well as the data itself. Where available, standardized and machine-readable documentation formats should be adopted. The documentation should put both the data and the research into context, detailing how the data has been collected, the conditions of the experiment, and any limitations on reuse. Data governance processes should ensure data is collected, processed, and stored ethically, responsibly, and comply to any legal requirements. Within a data sharing ecosystem, governance should include constraining how the data will be shared and who can access it. This could be done via data sharing consent frameworks or data sharing agreements. Data must be responsibly managed. When stewardship is done well, data is discoverable and accessible. Research resources should be archived and published using long-term, open access, referenceable storage locations. Data repositories should be findable and accessible. It's important that the best repository is chosen for the dataset in question. So this may be based on size of the dataset or the data type, and consider a specialised data repository. If the repository is citable, it will not only help track provenance and intellectual property, but also act as an incentive to researchers to share their data. Incentives can help encourage data providers to share their data, data users to reuse data, and all stakeholders to follow best practice. Suggested incentives included community-developed reward systems, challenge prizes, and having citable repositories. Many of the selected papers referred to, or in some cases extended, the FAIR principles. So they stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Five principles were found in only 1 or 2 of the papers, so not considered common themes, but were considered to be applicable to a wider audience than they were originally intended, and could therefore also be considered for inclusion in a more general set of principles. Prompt sharing of research and publications can help foster innovation and knowledge transfer, whilst reducing the chances of repeating existing research. Linking and combining data with other datasets can unlock further value, but can also lead to re-identification of de-identified data. Transparency is important, and permission should be sought if a recipient wishes to link data with other data. There is not just an increased demand for the skills of data scientists, but for a much wider group of users to be data literate. Suggestions on how to develop skills included embedding them in higher education curriculums or professional development courses. It is important that data can be found. The machine readability of the data and metadata should be maximised to ensure findability and interoperability. However, we must consider humans will be involved in the process. Machines are unlikely to be able to fully understand and process digital assets, meaning a human will always be involved in the process in some way. Humans and machines face different challenges discovering and retrieving datasets that are relevant. These differences should be taken into consideration when developing principles for data sharing and data reuse. The review has identified common themes and principles that, when combined, could be used as a basis for a set of principles that are agnostic to sector or the type of data that's being considered. Each set of principles that we have reviewed in this paper addresses policy in some way. However, what role would policy have in a set of policy principles that were agnostic to sector or discipline? The review has shown us that policy to promote data reuse is not a sufficient mechanism on its own. Practical guidance must be available in the form of suitable methodologies or frameworks. Further work is needed to establish whether such guidance could be delivered that is sector agnostic. Just as researchers must be aware of any changes in the legal and regulatory environments, policy and regulation must adapt as new technologies and uses of data emerges. Regulators and policymakers must also adapt to ensure they understand the role data will play. Principles and guidelines could be developed that help ensure a proactive approach to establishing policy rather than reacting to changes like the emergence of new technologies. Data reuse must be economically and socially beneficial if it is to become normal practice. The cultural barriers must be overcome as well as the practical or technical challenges. There is a need to develop a culture of trusted data sharing. This will require coordinated action from a range of stakeholders, and policymakers and regulators will play an important part. So to conclude, the ability to reuse data could deliver better value from the initial investments made by allowing an organisation to use their resources more efficiently, potentially saving time and money. The work that I have presented here has focused on a selection of principles that have been suggested as necessary to facilitate an ecosystem where data is reused. By addressing the research question, how do principles compare and what role does policy play? A comparison of the principles has identified 9 common themes and an additional 5 principles that, when combined, could be used as the basis for a set of principles that are agnostic to sector or data type. Policy plays an important role in ensuring these principles are practical. Practical guidance must be available in the form of suitable methodologies and frameworks. Further work is needed to establish whether such guidance could be delivered that is sector agnostic. Researchers, practitioners and policymakers must work together to develop a sector of sector agnostic principles and associated practical guidelines that will facilitate a data sharing ecosystem. Finally, if you're interested in any data-related problems in general, I would like to draw your attention to a newly funded centre that is being led by the University of Exeter and funded by DSTL. The Defence Data Research Centre, DDRC is in response to UK government's newly released Defence AI strategy and will focus on delivering practical insights to advance the use of data for artificial intelligence applications. Investigating data-driven decision-making within the defence context and exploring how solutions and mitigations developed by the Centre could be applied elsewhere to benefit the wider UK economy. More information can be found at this web address or by emailing myself for more details. Thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. More details can be found on the discussion paper that is found on the conference platform.